So I'd like to welcome everyone today. This is class 9, and it's amazing how quickly the weeks are rolling by. So I thought to introduce today's session with a passage by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And you might notice I pick a lot of quotations in my approach to presenting topics, and it's very, very deliberate, because I love keeping very close affinity with the root texts and their commentaries, including our current oral commentaries given by esteemed lineage holders. And this makes me feel much safer and more certain in my presentation, because I've always got a safe, kind of an ability to reach back and pick out a quote that supports what I've just said. And if I can't, then I have to go back to my homework. I do a lot of homework and work out where I stand in relationship to a point. And so that can be very productive as well. So I just mentioned that so that you don't think I'm being sort of pretentious or kind of scholastic, because it's never been my inclination to be scholastic at all. It's really a form of reverence for the sheer lucidity of the sources that we have available. And we're seeing this unfold as Dharma becomes more available in Western climates as well. We're getting more and more incredible resources. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama, I believe that for a Buddhist, the essential reason for this practice is that there are two ways to avoid suffering or pain. The first is to forget and try to bypass negative things and strive not to think about them. But that is an insufficient method and yields only temporary and transient benefits, because the problem remains intact. The other method of avoiding suffering consists in penetrating inside it, going to the heart of the problem itself and analysing it. In the beginning, the pain or the problem generally seems immense, a real mountain of woe. Yet, once one has begun to reflect upon it, seek out its origin, then analyse and study its nature, its gravity or intensity crumbles. The problem dwindles away. So that is the way one attempts to overcome the obstacle and untangle the problem. The Buddhist teaching calls for focusing precisely on this deeper nature, and to think in this way about old age, sickness, and death. It is a way to get to know them, or so I believe. End of quote. So I think you'll agree that's a remarkable passage, and very inspiring as well. And I think that's exactly what we're attempting to do in these classes, even though sometimes we do seem to be facing an insurmountable mountain of woe, as His Holiness so almost comically describes it, because it really does feel that way. I just wanted to touch on one other point as a lead-in to our Tonlen meditation at the start of the session, and that is this advice to start with oneself. And I know that came up in one of the discussions a couple of weeks ago, and I haven't had time to address it. But I wanted to refer that back to a seminal source as well, and I used Pabonka Rinpoche's Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand, which is an absolutely essential text, as is Lama Tsongkhapa's Great Lam Rim, Graduated Path to Enlightenment. So Pabonka Rinpoche says, there are many types of people with different degrees of ability. Some beginners feel that they are not capable of meditating on giving and taking. For these types of people, the text Training the Mind in 7 Points by Geshe Chekawa says, quote, build up your taking by starting with yourself. And he comments, in other words, meditate in the morning that you are taking on the suffering you'll experience that evening. Then move on to taking the next day's suffering. then your suffering for the rest of the month, and then for the rest of your year, and then for your present rebirth, then for your next rebirth, then all your future rebirths. Move on to your parents, your relatives and friends, strangers, enemies, and so on, until you include all sentient beings. So you can see here there's a very clear progression. It's crucial to follow this progression. Train yourself in each of the steps, says Pabonka, and then move on to the next, taking on the suffering, sins, obscurations, etc. of that particular level. You ought to follow these steps because you'll not be inclined at first to take suffering from such people as your enemies. This is really interesting, isn't it? They come last because it's the hardest, emotionally hardest to wish our enemy well. So sometimes meditate starting with yourself, moving outward in this way, and sometimes work your way from the hells up to the 10th level bodhisattvas. So we can also move successively through the different stage of rebirths from the states of greatest woe, greatest misery, up to those in very high realms. When we talk of taking on the sort of sufferings of bodhisattvas on the 10th bodhisattva bhumis, we have to be very careful here because they have actually exceeded samsara and are only taking rebirth through the power of compassion. They're no longer being thrown into cyclic existence through karma and afflictions. And this is the aspirational power of prayer for a bodhisattva. It is the inducement and creates the catalyst for their actual rebirth so that they're in a position to reach out and directly help us. So this is very inspiring. So in those cases, we obviously don't take on their suffering, but we can wish to take on their final obscuration to omniscience because they're not quite yet a Buddha. And also what I do is I twist it around a little bit using my own imagination, and I take on all the obstacles that might be met in the way of their final practice. Not that they've incurred it, but that their environment might create problems. So we take all those upon ourselves as well. So Pabonka Rinpoche is obviously teaching in a rural Tibetan setting. So he says, sometimes start with men and women in the upper part of your valley and work down. Sometimes start with those at the bottom of the valley and work up. So again, we can relate this to our street, even the rooms in our house or our suburb or our city or our neighboring city or our neighboring countries. And we can even include Putin and Russia somewhere along the way in this kind of meditation. So his whole, Pabonka Rinpoche says, take on even the sufferings of a dog being hit by a stone. So this is referring to the spontaneity of the method, that not only do we have this sort of technical way of moving through ever escalating stages of embracement in the practice, but we also know how to immediately respond with precision to a particular situation that's arising, such as we're going for a walk and suddenly we see someone brutally kick a dog. Take on the dog's suffering. Take on the owner's suffering. You have to feel sorry for someone who kicks a dog. So visualize that the things you do not disappear or get put to one side. They're taken right into the center of the heart. It is good if this makes you fear for your very life. So sometimes when we're doing this practice, we're suddenly struck, as I mentioned in a very early session, taking on my friend's cancer. I thought, crikey, what if I get cancer now? It seems so real, so powerful that doubt arose. So Pabonka Rinpoche is saying that's really special to have that doubt because we're rubbing right up against the boundary of the self-cherishing attitude. And it's only when we're there can we begin to actually dissolve that boundary effectively. You may not really be able to take these things when you do the meditation, but it will give you the great impetus to complete the merit collection. And if your mind becomes very familiar with the process, it is said that eventually you can actually take on these things, as illustrated by the story of Maitri Yogi. So Maitri Yogi actually saw a dog being hit on the leg with a stone, and he took on the suffering and found a bruise on his arm. So there are cases of very high lamas taking on any karmic obscurations to the long life of His Holiness, for example, and passing away in meditation. So these are extraordinary examples, but they're the outcomes of very, very highly developed spiritual attainment. And someone who's able to do that through the force of their meditation is in no danger of experiencing a normal death as we would know it. There's nothing to be afraid of, or there's nothing fearful in that scenario whatsoever. So I just mentioned that's sort of the sheer extent of the practice. So on that basis, we'll do the practice, and I'll recite it in English today while we quietly do the meditation on our own. So we can just spend a moment recollecting the motivation and deciding how we're going to approach the visualization today. And thus, O Venerable Compassionate Gurus, we seek your blessings that all karmic debts, obstacles and sufferings of all mother sentient beings may, without exception, ripen upon us right now, and that we may give our happiness and virtue to others, and thereby invest all beings in bliss. And thus, O Venerable Compassionate Gurus, we seek your blessings that all karmic debts, obstacles and sufferings of all mother sentient beings may, without exception, ripen upon us right now, and that we may give over our happiness and virtues to others, and thereby invest all beings in bliss. And thus, O Venerable Compassionate Gurus, we seek your blessings that all karmic debts, obstacles and sufferings of all mother sentient beings may, without exception, ripen upon us right now, and that we may give our happiness and virtues to others, and thereby invest all beings in bliss. So feel great joy as to how extraordinary it is that we're being able to muster this thought today. This thought, which is so rare. Countless rebirths we've experienced without even having begun to think of the possibility of such a thought, which is precisely the opposite of the self-cherishing mind. So with that, I'll ask Stephen to lead the prayers as usual. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Praise to Shakyamuni Buddha, to the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings. To you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Homage to the Supreme Buddha, homage to the Dharma refuge, homage to the great Sangha, to all three ever devout homage, to all worthy of respect, bowing with bodies, as many as all realms atoms in all aspects, with supreme faith I pay homage. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a visual aberration, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew or a bubble, a dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud. See conditioned things as such. Through these merits, may sentient beings attain the rank of all-seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from samsara's ocean, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. The Heart of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. I prostrate to the Arya Triple Gem. Thus did I hear at one time the Bhagawan was dwelling on massive Vulture's Mountain in Rajagriha, together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagawan was absorbed in the concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya, Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya, Avalokiteshvara. How should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya, Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Sharadvatiputra. Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness, there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness. No eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element, and so on, up to and including no mind element, and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on, up to and including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration and without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the end point of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly, completely awaken to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment in reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering, should be known as truth, since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared. Tayata Om Gate Gate Paragate Parasamgate Bodhi Soha. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagawan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage. It is like that. It is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom, just as you have indicated. Even the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagawan having thus spoken, the Venerable Sharadvatiputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, and those surrounding in their entirety, along with the world of gods, humans, asuras, and Gandharvas, were overjoyed and highly praised that spoken by the Bhagawan. The short mandala offering. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandala Kamniryatayami. Once in Tibetan and twice in English. Sangye Chodong Sokki Chognam La Janchu Bardu Dani Kyabsuchi Dagi Chenyen Gi Pe Sunam Gi Rola Penshir Sangye Drupar Shog. I go for refuge until I am enlightened. To the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened. To the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings.
Thank you. And I might ask John now to show us, we're going to toggle as usual between the Venerable Joan FPMT translation. We're going to start with verse 67, and we're going to then be jumping to the Burzen translation, which is a Geshe Nawandagi text, and it's verse 68 there. Which should be, so we're starting with 67 in the Venerable Joan, so it's the one above that. Yeah, thank you. It's 68 in Burzen's. We keep all our desires in our innermost heart. We senselessly blame all altercations on others, rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maria. And the Burzen translation, we have selfish desires and horrible anger which fester inside us. We would never admit, yet without provocation, we criticize others. And self-righteously charge them with faults we possess. Trample him, dance on the head of this treacherous concept of selfish concern. Tear out the heart of this self-centered butcher who slaughters our chance for final release. So again, we need to view ourselves and our behavior in the mirror of this verse. Do we fester selfish desires and horrible anger, which we would never openly admit? So we're referring to sort of subterfuge here. And when challenged or threatened, do we, quote, senselessly blame all altercations on others, end of quote, and even go so far as to self-righteously charge them with faults we possess. So usually we panic when we think we are lovingly harboring something detestable within ourselves. But with self-cherishing, we are so habituated, it is normal for us to harbor and fester in this way. So much so that we have elaborate conditioned strategies for not publicly admitting the selfish desires, etc., that we're internally harboring. This casts a new light on the very idea of depth psychology. It is not a matter of integrating the inner desires with our social self, but of excising, cutting out this self-cherishing mind altogether This is a radically Buddhist psychological proposition. Moving now to the image of scapegoating, or the issue of scapegoating. This is another shabby psychological tactic, particularly when we recognize that we are projecting our own faults onto others and then reading them back as coming from the outside in an attack formation towards us, straight towards us, directly at us. On the basis of this, we take incredible affront, even ferociously so, and are quite capable of striking out in a punitive fashion. How many domestic violent episodes are predicated on this kind of scenario? I was just thinking, I couldn't help but think that Putin's using the argument of self-defense at the moment from the horrors of neo-Nazi Ukraine. So to what extent is this scenario that's being used to bomb another country merely a grotesque projection of an individual's hallucinated pathology that is being harbored within? What extent can this kind of damage go? Even with one individual, it's really breathtaking, isn't it? So we're all doing this on a micro scale, and let's hope we're not going to be that person in a future life, or weren't that person in a past life who was capable of inflicting so much damage on so many others and destroying environments and so forth. So the conclusion is that we must recognize these conjuring acts, mental conjuring acts, for what they are, to call them out. Geshe Sopa succinctly says, this verse, like the previous ones, talks about, I'm quoting for his commentary here, John, so I don't think we'll find it there. Talks about a person full of selfish desires who blames others for all his or her quarrels. Naturally, we should place others' needs above our own. We should take responsibility for quarrels that have come about due to our own past negative actions. And Geshe Doga similarly says, as long as we hold this self-cherishing mind as the most important thing within us, there is no way that we can perform true spiritual practice. The way to find lasting peace and happiness is overcoming the self-cherishing mind and the attitude of always taking the gain for oneself and giving the loss to others. This is the attitude that we must reverse. So Geshe Doga adds, if we think about the long-term benefits, we will see that we can find more benefit and gain by doing the spiritual principle of placing the needs of others above our own needs, and even taking the loss upon oneself. So this idea of taking the loss upon oneself is a quintessential lojong thought transformation instruction. So in relation to our friend, we have a completely new way now of handling relationship conflicts, don't we? Completely different language and a completely different mode of identifying a problem and working with it. And if we're trying to uproot the self-cherishing attitude, our primary concern in overcoming that conflict is not to shore up our own brittle self-cherishing fortress so that it will be immune to any future attacks, but it will be deep concern for the welfare of the other person. How can we best help them in this moment? Completely different way of reading that very, very familiar situation. So I move now to verse 68, and I'm just going to refer to the Venerable Jones translation. Having dressed in saffron, we entreat spirits for protection and refuge. Having taken vows, our trainings comply with Mara. Rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, to the heart of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Maraya. So as I'm not dressed in saffron, I think it's best to let this verse speak for itself, because it's inappropriate for a lay person to judge the activities of a Sangha member. I'm not living in the vows, so I'm not in a position to sort of estimate what's happening there. However, the mention of entreating spirits for protection and refuge has obvious relevance for those, especially in the monasteries and nunneries, who choose to follow worldly spirits such as Doigul Shugden. I just mention this because FPMT has prepared a special web page on this very topic, and we can investigate it further. I can give you the link if you like, but you'll find it very easily if you just look up Shugden and FPMT. Kabje Zopa Rinpoche's foreword to His Holiness's second book on the topic is also reproduced there. Kabje Zopa Rinpoche says, relying on Dorgyul is extremely harmful to oneself. I think this is also a great harm to the world in general, as well as to sentient beings and to the teaching of the Buddha. Dorgyul is one who in the past broke Samaya vows and made harmful mistaken prayers to the teachings of our founder, Shakyamuni Buddha. This has been stated by one who knows the past and the future. So rather than malevolent spirits, we should rely on Buddhist deities who are manifestations of full enlightenment. This is the crux here, as these will not lead us astray. In other words, we can never trust a worldly spirit who may have the capability of apparently granting boons, some miraculous benefit like winning Tats Lotto, but it's never a happy ending. And there's a kind of another ground plan there, because the worldly spirit is still being driven by their own self-cherishing mind. And so they don't have your best interests in their heart. So I know this is a little bit alien to a Western perspective. And I know when His Holiness came to Melbourne and there was sort of a lot of press debate about this topic, and it made Tibetan Buddhism look rather silly in that it was somehow worried about worshipping spirits. But in the Buddhist pantheon cosmology, these things are real. Because we can't see a being with our eye doesn't mean that that being doesn't exist. So just keep an open mind here, but in your own practice, certainly don't get caught up in spirit. So seances with unskillful people are extraordinary events. You know, they have this board there and they invoke whoever wants to come along. There's no preparation there of the mandala, which we see so carefully in tantric practice, where we actually draw the fence around the inner mandala and we seal off any interference from malevolent forces. And it's only within that space we're then capable of performing very delicate, subtle psychological maneuvers, if you like, where our exterior consciousness has been absorbed into deep meditative states. So we don't want to be left vulnerable in those states. And so Buddhism is very careful to have a whole way of elaborating a protection fence and boundary and so forth. So I just mention these things because they're worth thinking about. But the main point here is that we're really talking about refuge. Pabonka gives advice about what we're not to do after having taken refuge, particularly formal refuge. He says, once you've taken refuge in the Buddha, you should not do things like take refuge in worldly gods. There are even now some monks who, if driven to desperation when things go wrong, will grovel abjectly before the idols of worldly gods. This is a disgrace to Dharma practitioners. As I've already told you, by taking only 2 refuges, you cast yourself out of the ranks of the Buddhists. So we've taken refuge in Dharma and Sangha, but we've somehow not taken refuge in the Buddha in this scenario. All the same, it is all right to offer ritual cakes, perform smoke purifications, make burnt offerings to the gods, nagas, spirit kings, and so forth, if you merely invoke their help in Dharma matters. However, you must not take refuge in them. It's like giving someone a bribe and asking them to help you. You don't have to take refuge in them. So this is just something to bear in mind. So will verse 69, we'll refer to the Berzin translation now, thank you. Our pleasure and happiness comes from the Buddhas, the gurus, the teachings, and those who live by them. Yet still we make offerings to ghosts and the spirits. All our guidance derives from the teachings, and yet we deceive those who give this advice. Trample him, and so forth. And the Venerable Jones translation, having been given happiness and pleasure by the deities, we make offerings to evil spirits. Having practiced the guiding Dharma, we deceive the 3 jewels. rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin, and so forth. So I don't feel that independent commentary is required for this verse, as it closely follows the intent of the last, is to draw us away from making offerings to ghosts and spirits. As I've mentioned, this willingness to do so shows a lack of comprehension of the very meaning of refuge, and more significantly, the meaning of relying on refuge. One story here, when Geshe Doga was escaping Tibet, as were so many at the time of the invasion of the bombing of Lhasa, over the mountains, it was very perilous, and there were Chinese posses of armed soldiers hunting for escaping monks. So it was a perilous undertaking. At one point, Geshe Doga's party was discovered, and a number of the monks ran for cover behind the rocks. And Geshe Doga tells this story very modestly, but he says he didn't run because he said his only refuge wasn't a rock, but it was the Buddha. And so there was a spray of bullets, and unfortunately a number of people in the party were killed, but Geshe Doga was unharmed. So one would have to say that even if Geshe Doga had the misfortune of being hit by a bullet, and even if that bullet had killed him, he was still incredibly fortunate if at that moment he was taking refuge in such a pure way, because we're all going to die, as we've been talking about, and it's about what we're going to do for others in the future. And so the kind of rebirth that would have manifested following that would have been an incredibly illustrious one, as it is for those incredible people we have in Australia. We've had one recently who swim out into dangerous tidal rips to save people from drowning, and then drown themselves in the process. So they've done that without a thought for themselves. So these are incredibly inspiring examples of compassion in action, aren't they? So this verse also touches on the issue of ethical restraints, because it's giving us advice about virtue and to avoid harming others. We recall that when we go for refuge, we do so on the basis of making pledges not to engage in any harmful activities, such as killing, stealing, and so forth. And so the very basis of refuge is a foundation in ethical practice. Such virtual observance in everything we do is the path. It doesn't augment the path or decorate the path. It is the path. The very fact that we're practicing virtue is pure Dharma practice, because it's leading to one escaping the lower realms, and it's leading us towards liberation and overcoming the obscurations to omniscience, so that we're fully empowered to benefit others. So in the Venerable Jones translation, she refers to deities in the opening line. She says, having practiced the deity of deities. Yeah, the pleasure by the deities. So that's referring to Shakyamuni Buddha. So when we're looking at deities there, we're actually talking about Shakyamuni Buddha. So I'll go now to verse 70. And I'll start with Berzin. We seek to have homes in monastic seclusion, yet drawn by distractions we venture to town. Discourses we hear teach us most noble practice, yet we spend our time telling fortunes with dice. Trample him, and so forth. And the Venerable Jones translation, having always stayed in isolated places, we are carried away by distraction. Having requested teachings on the Holy Dharma and the sciences, we support divinations and bond, rant and rave, and so forth. So the two translations seem different on the surface, but they do coincide if we stop to reflect. However, there's no mention of bond, which is the third line in the Venerable Jones translation, in the Berzin translation. And in its place in the Geshe Sopa translation, we don't find the word Bon, but we do find the word shamanism. So the reference to Bon is carried over into the Wheel of Sharp Weapons commentary by Geshe Jumper Gatso, which we've made available for this class. However, he reads it in a very particular way, which is, we try to trick others by making divinations and putting effort into Bon, that is, so he's qualifying its meaning, into various types of rites that are performed upon requests in people's homes. As such, I'm back to my commentary, there's no indication that the text is pointing to a particular kind of religious system, but rather to a common practice of performing practices in line with the expectations and wishes of the often superstitious lay community. Perhaps they need practices to overcome crop failure or personal infertility issues or serious illness and so forth. However, generally speaking, Bon refers to a plethora of ancient shamanistic traditions that existed and thrived in Tibet prior to the arrival of the Dharma in the 7th century. Later on, Bon was recognized and appreciated as having its own profound and distinct lineages, and its history can be seen running vigorously alongside those of the Buddhist lineages in their Tibetan manifestations, and it productively interweaves with them, so sort of cross dialogue. So Bon in the context of the verse seems to be used as a portmanteau term to cover various forms of shamanistic superstitions prevalent at the time of Dharmarakshita writing his verses. However, if we look at the history of the text, we only have the evidence for the dating based on the text colophon, which coincides with the text's appearance in collections of lojong texts in the 15th century. But as Dharmarakshita, the author of Wheel of Sharp Weapons, is known as the teacher of Atisha, this would necessarily place authorship back into the 9th century, circa 9th century. So there are many significant interpretive lexicological issues embedded here, which I'll leave aside. In other words, how could Dharmarakshita refer to Bon when there was yet to be a Tibetan context? So whatever the case, the shamanistic traditions might be considered superstitious. This is the key point. If we apply superstition to the Bon tradition as we know it today, and this is really why I've elaborated this point at some length, we run a grave risk of damaging the legitimacy and coherency of Tibet's wondrous spiritual tradition. We also show disrespect to its esteemed teachers, including influential and immensely popular contemporary teachers such as Geshe Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche, who taught extensively in the West. We also run the risk of not recognizing how Bon and Dzogchen practice lineages significantly overlap. Additionally, we run the danger of judgmentally scorning or downplaying, as in the case of Australian Aborigines, whose culture dates back 65,000 years, even the very nature of shamanism. So there's lots of loaded things here we have to unpack. So it's common from a colonialistic point of view to regard genuine shamanistic traditions, pre-modern traditions, inverted commas, I have to put inverted commas, as superstitious, but that's a grotesque distortion of the colonial ideologies, because it completely delegitimizes the depth and authenticity of those practices. And just to touch on that, here in Australia, because we've had massive bushfires, I know you've been having them in America as well, there's a very concerted effort now for farming, the government to ask Aboriginal traditional owners to instruct government land caretakers in the traditions of ritual fire burning, because they destroy, or not destroy, but they diminish the undercarriage of the forests, which then prevents them from going up in huge conflagrations. And I know this is an issue here for you as well in California with the giant sequoias, which are normally immune to fires, but recently 2,000-year-old trees have been perishing in massive firestorms. So just to say, we have to be very careful equating shamanism with superstition. So the real gist of this stanza is that this verse is drawing our attention to the fact that despite the fact that we have all the signs of exemplary practice, such as we live in retreats in isolated places and so forth, we're constantly being led by the nose to the attractions of the marketplace and the allures of superstitious magic that cannot be called holy Dharma, even as it distracts us from Dharma's true purpose. All of this is due to succumbing to the self-cherishing attitude, our real master. Therefore, we publicly parade as practitioners, yet we remain self-cherishing's faithful slave. So we'll now move to verse 71 and the Venerable Jones translation. Having rejected morality and liberation, we grasp at a home. Having poured our happiness and pleasure into water, we chase after suffering. Rant and rave on the head of the conception that brings about our ruin to the hearts of the enemy, the self, and the executioner, Mahayana. The meaning of the first line of this is rendered obvious in the Burson translation. He says, we give up monks' vows, the true path to freedom. We would rather be married, have children and homes. We cast to the wind this rare chance to be happy and pursue further suffering, more problems and woes, trample him, and so forth. So that's yeah. So we're referring here to forfeiting the great good fortune to live in ordination. Instead, we choose to be married, have children and homes. In other words, we accept to tether ourselves to a worldly life. Why? Because we have no comprehension of the real meaning of renunciation. So this is a question that lay people have to ask as well, because it's possible to have renunciation as a lay person, and it's possible to have renunciation in a relationship, in a family, in a home. But it takes very, very particular psychological strength to maintain such a subtle position because of the incredible impact of the demands of worldly life itself. So in other words, this verse is saying that we need to establish the right causes and conditions. Geshe-Doga, quote, this verse is saying that if we wish to achieve the state of liberation from suffering, or even if we wish to find immediate peace and happiness in this lifetime, the only way for it to occur is to create the right causes and conditions. And he then refers to the necessity of training in the threefold training, referring to the training in moral ethics or discipline, concentration, and wisdom. And these are taught extensively in the path of the intermediate being in the Lam Rim, that person who is seeking escape from samsara altogether. And if we're practicing as a bodhisattva trainee, we're seeking to escape samsara in order to progress on the bodhisattva path. But in understanding renunciation of samsara in our own meditation, we're able to generate great compassion for the first time. This is really crucial. I've stressed this at the beginning of a few of the talks. It said that great compassion arises from renunciation, from definite emergence. Because renunciation means definite emergence. We're definite to emerge from samsara with the mind of renunciation. In the West, we tend to see renunciation as somehow chopping something up, off and giving something up. And a kind of a loss, a tragic loss even. But it's not that at all. It's the opening of a door to incredible, wonderful things. So it's really has to be swung around. So in general, moral ethics refers to restraining from harmful, negative, virtuous actions. And this is, again, a unique character in Buddhism, because in some traditions, we see ethics externally existent, being applied as sort of forces to the world for the habitat of the individual. But in Buddhism, ethics doesn't exist externally at all. It's merely a description of our mode of action of body, speech, and mind. It can be either virtuous, non-virtuous, or neutral, depending on its character. That is ethics. And so restraining from harm is the practice of pure morality. It's something we do rather than something we sort of observe, if you like, from beyond. And this is because there's no creation God in Buddhism. It's sort of fundamentally non-theistic in this regard. And so it comes back to the responsibility of our own minds to regulate what occurs and unfolds in our experience. So to put it simply, moral ethics refers to refraining from the 10 non-virtuous actions. And Geshe Doga says that we can understand this just by using common sense, because the Buddhist description of the 10 non-virtuous actions is almost exactly repeated in law, secular law in most of our countries, isn't it? If you steal or kill or do sort of damaging adultery and so forth, these are all potentially criminal activities. So Shantideva, in a very famous stanza, so it's chapter 1, verse 28, says, although wishing to get rid of misery, they run towards misery itself. Although wishing to have happiness like an enemy, they ignorantly destroy it. So this kind of perversity is what's being described in this verse. Thereby there's a real contradiction declared between what we wish for and how we proceed or fail to proceed to obtain it. Because we're always engaging and indulging in pleasures, we create not the causes for liberation, but only more suffering. This is what Shantideva and this verse is talking about. Our methodology is therefore fundamentally counterproductive and might be even considered perverse because it guarantees the opposite of what it promises, suffering instead of liberative happiness. And so we know this, don't we? And it's sort of rather curiously carried out when you have skin products called Nirvana, or there's even skin products called Samsara at one stage. It was a bit mind-boggling whether they were actually suggesting that you shouldn't use them. But this is sort of promise in our consumer culture. I don't need to go on here, but it promises freedom and liberation from suffering, doesn't it? Even a skin cream is going to have that benefit if you buy an expensive one. And so this is all a con. This is all how we get sidetracked so easily. So these are just funny examples, aren't they, of a bigger problem. So the next verse sort of brings this home. Verse 72 in the Venerable Jones translation. Having rejected the crossing to liberation, which is what's happened, we roam about in remote places. Having obtained a precious human body, such as we currently have, we accomplish the hells, rant and rave, so forth. So accomplishing the hells, this is pretty hard hitting, but the reality is we're experts at accomplishing the hells. Pabonka says, as long as we remain uncritical, we never respect that we are going to the lower realms. We probably think that we more or less keep our vows, perform most of our daily recitations, and have not committed any serious sin, such as killing a person and running off with his horse. The trouble is, we have not looked into things properly. We should think it over in detail, and if we do, we would see that we are not free to choose whether we go to the lower realms or not. This is, of course, because it's determined by our karma. We have a mixture of virtuous and non-virtuous karma in our mind streams. The stronger of these two will be triggered by craving and grasping or clinging when we die. And so I gave an account of those two I think it was last week or the week before we die. When we look into which of these two is the stronger, we'll see that it is non-virtue. So just a lot of room there to contemplate. And so that's why I have used the term before, and I sort of made this term up, but I use it for myself because it helps. I call it karmic modesty. And what I mean by that is we have to be modest in the face of the enormity of our past karma. We might claim to be a virtuous person, and we might even have right to claim to be a virtuous person in this lifetime, but we may be carrying some very, very significant heavy karma from the past that isn't ripening under the current circumstances. And so this is why the teachers are always stressing the need for mindfulness and introspection, which I've also elaborated very carefully in past talks, because we have to be looking at what's unfolding in the mind as it's unfolding if we're going to practice moral ethics in this way. So there are a number of ways of talking about karma, and I won't go into much detail, but the strength of a karma is determined by the force of the motive, the deed, and the final step. Thus, this is Babonka talking, although we might think we have only done smaller non-virtues, their force is in fact enormous. And it gives the example of one scornful word. He says, suppose you say one scornful word to your pupils, for instance. You are motivated by a strong hostility. And as for the deed, you use the harshest words that can really wound them. And for the final step, you feel proud and have an inflated opinion of yourself. These three parts, motivation, deed, and final step, could not have been done better. He's been sardonic there, obviously. Suppose you kill a louse. Your motive is strong hostility. You roll the louse between your fingers and so on, torturing it for a long while, and then eventually you kill it. For the final step, you think that was helpful and become very smug. So the non-virtue has been extremely powerful. So he also points out that our virtue is weak. We may feel it's very strong, but in fact is extremely weak. So he says, first there is our motive. I think it's rare for us to be motivated by even the least of motives from a Buddhist perspective, which is yearning for a better rebirth, let alone the best of motives, bodhicitta, or the next best, renunciation from cyclic existence. Right at the beginning, he says, we usually aspire to achieve desires related to this life's trivia. Any prayers we make to this end are in fact sinful. Then for the main part of the deed, there is no pure joy of enthusiasm to it. When we recite even one rosary of Om Mani Padme Hum, for example, our minds cannot stay focused for the whole time. Everything is either sleep or distraction. It is difficult to do things well for even the time it takes to recite the hundreds of gods of Tushita, which is Lama Tsongkhapa's Guru Yoga practice, which is about 3 or 4 pages. And when it comes to making the final prayers and dedications, we slip back in directing them towards this life. So although we might feel we have done great deeds, in fact, they are only feeble. So I think I've made that point pretty clearly. So this is something we all need to consider. So therefore we must trample the self-cherishing attitude underfoot. So we'll move now to will verse 73. Venerable Joan. Having set aside the transformative attributes of the Dharma, we make a profit. Having left behind our Dharmas, classes, we wander about the cities and countryside, rant and rave on the head of the conception. And the Burzen translation offers, ignoring effects that the teachings can bring us, we travel on business for gain and profit, leaving behind all our Guru's wise lectures. We tour different places in search of some fun. So the point is here, and again, we have to apply this to ourselves, though we have brushed up against the transformative attributes of Dharma and have thus gleaned or at least sensed something of the liberative promise that it brings us, nonetheless, We put it aside in order to pursue our worldly ambitions, all in the name of searching for some fun, ephemeral fun. So the Dharma here is something which we don't just brush up against or even learn about intellectually, but we must put it into practice. And this is because Dharma is something that holds or maintains its own nature. That's one of the meanings of Dharma. It's a thing which holds its own nature. And in this sense, we can understand it as a Dharma holds the mind in a beneficial way. This is what the Dharma does. In other words, it means that any spiritual practice that directs the mind away from a negative way of thinking is a Dharma in this context. So I think I'll leave that there, just to say that we have to be sifting through our different states of mind that determine our feelings, as well as our actions of body, speech, and mind. Because if we're going to gain control over the sort of force propulsion of the self-cherishing attitude, we need to be able to break down how it operates. So just to control our speech is already a remarkable practice of moral ethics, isn't it? Because we tend to blurt something out before we've even thought it, or it seems that way. And that sneering word that Pabonk was talking about, that punctures and wounds the student, is designed, as he also describes so vividly, to have the ultimate wounding power. And that's all almost instantaneous. And so we need to step right back and begin to see how a sense of arrogance and pride, for example, might create the ground for that sneering word to arise so freely. So we need to unpack. So will verse 74 in the Venerable Joan, we'll only look at the Joan translation here, John. Having forsaken our own means of livelihood, we appropriate communal property. Having given up earning our own food, we steal it from others, rant and rave. So communal property here means we take advantage of others' belongings and resources. And we do this out of selfish interest, as it enables us not to engage our own means of legitimate livelihood. In other words, we're bludgeoning on the kindness and resources of others. That this amounts to stealing, or a form of stealing, is made clear by the second line, which says, having given up our earning our own food, we steal it from others. So we're bludgeoning. We're not working because we're taking the fruits of the work of others, even without it being offered to us. This is sort of a miserable behaviour. So to give a few more examples, when the huge tsunamis took place a number of years ago, the world sent millions of dollars in relief funds, emergency funds, and the ones that arrived in Sri Lanka were siphoned away by corrupt bureaucrats, so that the fisher village people who had been most impacted by the tsunami were left without any resources to rebuild their shattered lives and environment. So this is an example of this kind of stealing happening at a larger level. And in the commentaries, examples are given, such as a large monastic donation, which was intended for all the Sangha, is diverted by one individual and put towards a private project. That's another example. And looting, this is something that's come up in Australia, looting houses temporarily abandoned during a flood evacuation alert. So all of these are problematic, they're problematic anyway, but they're particularly problematic because they indicate that we're not concerned about the needs and feelings of others. Geshe Doga notes, we see many cases of such theft occurring even in wealthy countries. So this isn't something that's just confined to people who do not have very much. The wealthy are also capable of performing these kinds of thefts. And it's because they're lazy and they are driven by insatiable greed. It's not simply acquiring the minimal necessities for life. So I don't think I need to elaborate much more there. So we'll verse 75 in the Venerable Joan, and then we'll jump to the Burzen after that. So, our fortitude in meditation is little, but our clairvoyance is sharp. I think it'd be nice to have an exclamation mark there. So, our fortitude in meditation is little, but our clairvoyance is sharp. Not having begun the path, our feet senselessly race about, rant and rave on the head, and so forth. So Burzen says, it's amazing how little endurance we have to do meditation, and yet we pretend to have gained special powers, so others are fooled. We never catch up with the paths of deep wisdom, yet run here and there in needless great haste. So this verse uses a kind of sarcasm to score its point when it says, our clairvoyance is sharp. This is referring to our tendency to self-inflate and publicly broadcast our spiritual achievements, even while shirking any real engagement with the necessary practices. If you have genuinely achieved a spiritual realization, you won't talk about it. Genuine realizations will elude us in the future if we do talk about it. And even in the future, if we do achieve some degree of realization, it will not be stable and it won't be believed by others. And we will lack the respect of others irrespective of our attained realization. So these are all the consequences karmically of sort of playing in this fake way. So therefore, to lie about our attainments is the opposite of spiritual practice. And I just want to mention here, this is one of the great advantages in having a spiritual teacher, because they will examine our claim to have a realization, and it might be a genuine claim, and expose it as a sham if it needs to be. So there's a kind of rigor that can be brought to bear in that relationship. If we leave it up to our own ego devices to judge whether or not we're a sham practitioner or not, we're in danger of elaborately hoodwinking ourselves. And this is the kind of hoodwink that a skillful teacher will puncture. And so I know that some people have claimed to realize emptiness and they've gone to see Lama Zopa Rinpoche, and he'll say, or what appears to your mind at the time of the realization. And they're then going to talk about a variety of things that are appearing. But if you've actually genuinely at that moment set the mind on emptiness, a mere non-affirming negative appears, which is the sheer lack of the object of negation. And that is what appears. Nothing else is suggested in its place. So if at that time you had this sort of elaborate conceptual runaway activity, it's a sign that you haven't at that moment realized emptiness. It's not to say there might not be some benefit in what you're doing, but it's not the realization that you claim it to be. So it just takes that one question by Lama Zopa Rinpoche to set that student back on the right track again. So only the kindness of a teacher is going to do that. So, so if we wish to catch up with the paths of deep wisdom, which are mentioned in this verse, we really need to slow down and take stock of our approach. So verse 76, Venerable Joan only this time. When someone tells us something beneficial, we consider him with animosity to be an enemy. When someone tricks and cheats us, we consider that heartless one to be kind. Rant and rave on the head, the conception. So this is pointing out how self-cherishing is precisely counterproductive. We scorn those who would tell us something helpful about ourselves. We've all caught ourselves doing this. Someone says, oh, look, you know, you're really aggressive in your encounter with that person at the shop the other day. Did you realize that you really upset and offended them? And instead of saying, oh dear, I hadn't thought about that, and then taking it on board and generating some genuine regret, we say, I'll stop being stupid. Nothing happened. It's just a shop assistant. It's just a momentary encounter. It is elaborating, carrying on. And so you've dismissed it. So self-cherishing has refortified itself through a spurning of valuable criticism and advice coming from outside. And we'll even go further. If the person brings it up again, we'll get hostile and tell them to piss off, go away, just leave me alone, mind your own business. And so it becomes an attack on them. This is how self-cherishing works. So it's very interesting, isn't it? So we need to relate it to our own experience. How have we reacted when a dear friend, out of affection, very pertinently mentions something of our faults? And this is really dealing with the nitty-gritty of our relationships, our intimate relationships, isn't it? Have we construed that they are harming us rather than helping us at that moment? This is a really powerful question to ask. And this construction that they're harming us may occur at a seemingly unconscious level because we're so acclimatized to responding to criticism, even when just, with defensive hostility. How have we reacted when someone motivated by dissimulation and deceit, has praised whatever we do, irrespective of whether or not we deserve such praise? So this is looking at the other side of that afflicted equation. Even if someone flatters us on the basis of something that we don't actually have the right to own, we'll still take delight in the fact that they're flattering us, won't we? How amazing is that? Even though it's not true, it's irrelevant. In fact, one wonders, doesn't it, Mr. Trump's narcissistic sort of personality disorder seems to flourish in this environment of taking delight in people flattering, even if there's maybe no one home. I hope I'm not upsetting people politically. We get a lot of American press here and we get the nitty-gritty of what's happening with the gerrymandering of the election boundaries and so forth. It's a real concern for us because we're all concerned about the future of democracy, in other words. So have we seen these people who flatter us as somehow kind, and do they seem attractive to us at that moment? So the truth is that sycophancy does work for the self-cherishing attitude. It can even feed on it. So we move now to Will verse 77, Venerable Joan. We tell the confidential talk that depends on being family to enemies. When we have close friends, we unabashedly still their hearts and minds. And Berzin says, when others consider us close and dear friends and relate in strict confidence all they know, we disclose their deep secrets, especially to their foes. When we have a good friend who is constantly with us, we locate his weak points so that we can torment him. So this verse is dealing with what we call in sort of Western psychological and sort of sociological terms, violating social boundaries. It's verse 78. Oh, there we go. Are we a boundary violator? This is a confronting question. Do we disclose sensitive and intimate family secrets to a third party without considering the impact of the family member or family involved? Do we locate someone's weak points in order to torment or get at them? Do we expose confidentially whispered secrets to a third party, even when the person with the secret has expressly begged us not to? The reality is that it is not healthy or safe to stay in the close proximity of a boundary violator. This because boundary violators, and self-cherishing is a boundary violator by its very nature, compulsively engages in repeated boundary violations and therefore will not desist from such behaviour no matter what you do or what constraints you attempt to set into place. In the case of using intimate or confidential information about someone to bully and intimidate them, we can easily step over into criminal activities such as psychological and physical abuse. So this is sort of the extreme of this kind of boundary violation. If someone else is violating our boundaries, it's clear we're left with the decision whether or not to limit or cut off contact. That's the sign of how dangerous, how perilous it is. And with ex-partners, often in situations with shared children, we've got all the custody battles that take place around those, there's often a violation of boundaries to gain advantage, even and to manipulate us. So the second line, when we have close friends, we unabashedly still their hearts and mind. This also refers to our potential to engage in social abuse. Unabashedly here refers to ruthlessly and shamelessly taking advantage in order to overpower someone. And so there was a fascinating program on our ABC, our national broadcaster, the other day on serial fantasists on dating apps. And so it was the testimonials of a number of women who had met men online through dating services and gone into relationships with them, only to discover, often years later, that the entire relationship from these cases, man's side, was a con built up to often gain vast amounts of money from the woman. And so there was a series of testimonials given, and all the women had similar stories about what were referred to as serial fantasists, because they're using fantasy about who they are to take advantage of someone, and they're using love and intimacy as the avenue to having a very penetrating boundary violation at the deepest level. And so one of the women talked about becoming severely depressed and suicidal when she discovered that all the time that she was with her partner for 4 years, he was meanwhile living at home with his wife and 2 children. He even got her to spend $10,000 on furniture for the house that he showed her from the street, saying that this is the house we're going to buy, we're buying the furniture for it now. And 2 weeks later, she discovered, while she was sitting outside doing a little bit of forensic investigation, she was becoming suspicious, that it was the house in which he lived with his wife and children. How amazing is that? How devastated would you be to have that experience, to be shattered, your trust to be shattered in that way? So these are very serious problems, and they're endemic problems in our culture. So we must bring, says Venerable Geshe-Doga, faith, genuine faith and trust to our relationships, and we mustn't try to sustain them superficially. And we also must respect the confidentiality of those who do sincerely confide in us. There may be some exceptions. I'm just thinking someone with suicidal ideation may confess that they're planning to do something. And so under those sorts of extreme circumstances, you might argue with a good motivation, in fact, I would, that you can tell someone else in order to gather together some support structure. So skillful means comes into it here, but it's all got to do with the motivation, hasn't it? So tear out the heart of this self-centered butcher. So I'll now jump to verse 78, but we'll refer to verse 79 in Berzin, I think, if that's not too. Our jealousy is strong, and whatever is said, we are always a skeptic. We doubt what is meant. We are fussy, bad-tempered, and hard to get on with, inflicting obnoxious behaviour on others. Trample him, trample him. So we're faced here with or we're presented here with a litany of personality flaws, strong jealousy, extreme skepticism as to the truth of whatever is said, fussiness, bad temper, perhaps chronic, being hard to get on with, and inclined to inflict obnoxious behaviour on others. So if we approach these sorts of problems from a Western psychological perspective, we'll be encouraged to transform such destructive behaviours in various, often very, very effective ways. And so I'm not critiquing this approach at all. But at no point is that Western psychological sort of therapeutic model going to propose that the fundamental problem is self-grasping and self-cherishing at the root. This is not to say that Western psychological traditions aren't very valuable and useful, but that the Buddhist methodology for transforming the mind extend much beyond that immediate sort of profile, if you like. So I'll just touch again on the Buddhist, we call it ontology. It's how something arises. And I've mentioned this before, it's the evolution of the afflictions, but it's worth bearing in mind. And there is one of our questions on this as well. Through ignorance, we superimpose an intrinsic findability onto this I, the merely existent I, which we then grasp as existing in that truly existent way. This grasping takes the form of an identification with that conceived I that is superimposed and mixed with the real I or conventional I as the real I. It becomes impossible to separate the fabrication from the merely existent I. Upon this basis, this confused basis, we discriminate between an inherently existent I and an inherently existent other than I. This is really, really important to get on board with, because we don't just construct this one through an hallucinated false projection, but on the basis of that, we construct everything other than it in relation to it in a false way. So it seems to be inherently other because it's not I. And so this is already one of the reasons why self-cherishing can become so powerful, because we see the other as inherently the other. So one of the tests of this, I'm sort of preempting some of the later verses. I label this body and mind I quite legitimately. But if you label this body and mind I, it won't work because I'm your other. And so what is the basis for labeling I in my case isn't the basis for labeling I on my aggregates. You have to label your I on your own aggregates, thank you very much. And so there's a kind of relativity here, because if I was inherently my aggregates without it being superimposed by delusion, then when you look at me, you wouldn't see me. Anyway, off we go. It becomes a very, very fascinating investigation, doesn't it? I couldn't be seen as, if I was really I, or putting it the other way, if I was I really, and you look at me, you could only see I in me, but I'm me, you're other. And so it depends how you're looking at it, what perspective's being used as to whether this is an I or whether this is another. And so I can't be inherently either an I or another. They're relative. So this becomes, a really important form of investigation. So independence on this, our craving or an attachment for this I arises. We crave for the happiness of this, which means we set up all the dialectics to do with protecting that happiness, such as craving for possessions, our body, and so forth. Being obsessed with qualities in things, we seek them as a source of happiness, so they become mine. And so mine here is part of the problem, making mine. Seeing unpleasant qualities, we spurn them and we grasp at their separation as a form of happiness. Through the afflictions thus produced, so I've only now got to the afflictions, can you believe it? Through the afflictions thus produced, anger, craving, desire, jealousy, pride, and so forth, arise through conceptually motivated processes. And it's such action that causes the life cycle to be constantly held together. So anger, jealousy, pride, and so forth, from a Buddhist perspective, are identified as afflictions produced as the end product of an unfolding causal evolution that starts from the primal root cause, superimposing an intrinsic findability onto this I, which we then grasp at as existing in that way. So the unique Buddhist proposition here is, unless this grasping is overcome at its root, the afflictions will continue to be generated in various ways. This entails that we recognize not just what self-grasping is, but how it relates in the sense of supports self-cherishing. So I was going to go on there a little bit more about a notion of what a Buddhist therapy might look like. This is certainly an interesting question, and there are some very, very interesting practicing theorists and psychologists working out of a Western tradition who are sincerely looking at emptiness, for example, as part of their therapeutic toolkit. And so there's beginning to be a kind of a dialogue at a very deep level between the two, stimulated by His Holiness's work with mind and happiness conferences. So Will verse 79, Venerable Jones translation: when appealed to, we turn away without listening and inflict harm. When bowed to, we do not bow in return, but from a distance look for an argument. So again, I don't think a lot of commentary is needed, but it's interesting, isn't it, that when others look to us for support, we angrily or irritably turn away without listening to them and thus inflict harm. Or we listen for a bit, but then don't follow through because we're too mean or miserable to help. Or when others show us respect, we don't return it or seek to return it. Rather, we remain aloof and remote and condescending. And even, this verse suggests, we look for an argument to pick fault in the other. This is because we may be jealous or envious of them. So Geshe Doga talks about the problems of being short-tempered in relation to this verse. I mean, it's still talking about problems of being short-tempered, that if we are short-tempered, even a very minor cause is enough for us to lose our temper and become angry, outrageously angry. Or we might remain suspicious and skeptical, or even scornful when others extend a genuine helpful hand of support and consolation. So how often have we smacked away a hand of consolation that's been offered to us? Sometimes we have these sorts of scenarios where we might be dealing with grief, for example, and someone genuinely offers us a bowl of soup, and instead of graciously receiving it, we miserably react or don't open the door or whatever it is that happens. So these are sort of concrete examples of this verse in practice. So in opposition to anger, Geshe Doga says we should develop patience or tolerance, as this is the source of lasting inner peace and stability. And so the role of meditation comes in here, because the only way of really tackling disturbing, distracting thoughts is engaging meditation practice. And so meditation from a Buddhist perspective is our therapy session. So I just wanted to say that. So I'll just deal with one more verse. It gets up to verse 81. We do not pay attention to what others tell us. We are a trial to be with. We strain others' nerves. Our feelings are hurt at the slightest remark, and we hold grudges strongly. We never forgive. Trample him, trample him. So again, this verse is diagnosing a sort of litany of self-cherishing manifestations, such as conceit. We have no need to pay attention to what others tell us because we know better. We're a nightmare to be with. We're a strain on everyone's nerves. We're overly sensitive so that we're hurt at the slightest remark. We hold unrelenting grudges. We have an inability to forgive others while constantly indulging ourselves, including our own weaknesses and faults. And so we need to check up. And so these verses can be used as the basis of our meditation practice. We can engage in analytical meditation. For example, to sit in meditation and then to raise the question, when was I last so obnoxious that others felt obliged to clear away from our presence? When was I last so preoccupied with my problems that I imposed my problems on everyone else without even stopping to consider how I might be affecting or overwhelming them? When did I last respond in terms of a long-harbored grudge, perhaps one going back weeks, months, or years? In the same meditation, see if you can reverse your afflicted response. For example, do giving and taking on behalf of those who have fled from our obnoxious presence. So pick them as our meditation object and do giving and taking. Take on all the problems of others onto myself rather than give all my problems to everyone else. Give everything necessary with joy and freedom in our heart to a person whom I have formerly held a grudge against. So these are really pithy and powerful practices. And this is sort of the level of practice that we're talking about when we're trying to integrate the meaning of these verses. So again, Geshe Doga says, meditation practice enables us to understand that the main source of our problem lies within. This is contrary to our normal belief which is that the source of our problems is always external. If we meditate as described, Geshe Doga says, we will begin to experience benefits from that practice because you'll be overcoming the inner source of problems, end of quote. And this is a very profound realization, one that will give us great courage and optimism going forward. So now I'll stop there. And we're up to verse 81. I'm sort of looking at the timing. We've got one extra session scheduled, so I don't know if everyone's recognized that. It's a very valuable one. I had a talk with the Venerable Dondrup, and he couldn't extend the course by more than one session because of a very tight timetabling. And I certainly don't want to make things more difficult for him, but nor do I want to make things more difficult for you. So I think we'd have to say that last session is an add-on, and it would be wonderful if you can attend. And I'll attempt to outline the requirements for the exam. How many of us are going to do the exam? Do we know, Stephen? So let me know if 3, yeah. So I'll also take that into consideration, and I might even have a separate session for those people then, rather than take up the last session. So we can talk, I'll talk 4. Do let Stephen know, and with names, so that we can sort of plan towards that, because the idea is that everyone passes in a wonderful way. I want you to enjoy doing the exam, and it's certainly not onerous. And so even if you hadn't considered doing it, you might want to. You could even do it informally, and then when you realize what a fantastic job and how much you've enjoyed it, you might decide to give it to Stephen anyway. So we'll just leave that open. It's a soft option. 5.
Oh, I have a question, Ross.
Yeah.
So Danny had a question from earlier, but she kindly held it until the end. So she wanted to know about homework 8, question number 3. What is the meaning of Maraya, first used in the Venerable Joan translation in verse 52 and as a part of the refrain found in verses 55 to 90? She said she found a translation that translated Maraya as ego. So I wondered if you could shed some light on that.
Yeah. My translation in Geshe Jumpa Gatso referred to it as strike at the heart of that enemy, which is ego. So I think it's sort of implicit. If we're looking at it as meaning ego, it's implicit that that's the object that we're striking to kill. But I took it more to be a kind of war cry. Marawa, strike the ego. And so it's this sort of cohesive act to eliminate that problem. So I'll go into it a little bit more. That's the only reference. I'd have to refer to a Sanskrit dictionary, I think, to go into it in more detail. But it's not there in the other translations. So it's rather interesting, isn't it? So let me know what the other sources are that you come up with there too, because I'll be very interested.
Thank you, Ross. And I think Doris has a question as well. Yeah. Go ahead, Doris.
Well, I have a comment, but I just wanted to say something about the Maraya. In Geshe, I put his initials in my notes as GJG. Yeah. He translates, he says that Maraya is literally in Sanskrit to kill.
Yes, yeah, he does. Yeah.
So that's where I went with my answer.
Yeah, he does. He said, and it says it's to kill precisely too. Like it's not just to kill in general, but it's to kill that one.
Right.
And so there's a kind of a targeting, a precise target. And that's why I took it to be a war cry, because it's say, now kill that one. So it's a call to act to kill, but that one. So it's kind of directed. So yes, I think that's useful, but that's where I got my interpretation from as well. Geshe Jumpa Gatso. And so that commentary is available in the Google library we have.
And my comment goes back to, I missed a couple classes early on and I had to catch up with the homework. And you heard me say how it was such a slog. Do you remember? But I'm actually enjoying the homework now. You know, like it's really helping me internalize it. And I don't mind jumping between all the commentaries anymore. So progress. Thank you.
Yeah, to really relax and enjoy. I find there's so much learning takes place through a kind of a creative impulse, if you like. And I love it when you can just sort of open a book, like something as wonderful as this one, and you just literally open it at random. And look, example, any sin of great and intolerable force will overpower any virtue other than sublime bodhicitta. How wonderful is that quote? And it was just by opening a book. And so the Dharma texts are so precious and so valuable. And it's not really about making a mistake when you answer the exam questions or the homework questions. It's just exactly that we go on a sort of investigative journey. And that's what Geshe Doga is referring to as analytical meditation. We need to develop that skill, that interpretive skill. And it does take courage when we're dealing with the afflictions. Because that example I gave a few minutes ago of when was I last so obnoxious that someone else had to flee from my presence? Can we really come up with an example? And if we can, relive it, picture it vividly in the meditation until we really feel how incredibly yucky that behavior was, until we feel shame. Shame in this case is really productive because we suddenly recognize what we've done. So I know Stephen wants to have the discussion, so we'll stop there, but keep raising questions and keep reading. And there's this wonderful book too, which is a collection of thought transformation texts, which includes Wheel of Sharp Weapons in a very fine translation, of course, by Thupten Jinpa, His Holiness's translator, and he's also the principal editor of this incredible series, the Library of Tibetan Classics. And so this is the compendium of mind training texts that was referred to earlier as coming from the 15th century, and it's absolutely priceless. And it includes commentaries on a number of the texts as well, which are also part of the canon. And so there's an incredible amount of resources here. And this book's also available as a PDF or Kindle book as well. So I just mentioned that. So spending a little bit of time browsing is very good. So thank you, everyone. It's been a delight, and take care. And I even remember daylight saving today. It's a bit uncanny having to change, but here we are. So enjoy. See you.
Thank you, Ross.
Bye-bye. Oh, final prayers quickly, yeah. I say quickly, intensely quickly, yeah.
Thank you very much, John. Dedication prayers. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings, without exception, into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Long life prayers for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world. To the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, Kyabje Lama Zopa Rinpoche. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And Tenzin Osel Hita, Venerable One, to you whose kindness exceeds that of all conquerors for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West, mindful of your loving concern for us in intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land, we make this request. O Lama, please, please live long. Thank you.
Thank you very much.